In this video, we'll learn how to transform paint once it reaches our paint buffer here inside of MARI. Okay, great. So I've got the back of the female's body shown here, and I'm going to go ahead and use the paint through tool to quickly drop this dragon tattoo onto her back. And again, I'm not going to bake this. As a matter of fact, if I just come over here to my projection palette, you'll notice here that I'm going to switch my bake behavior to clear only. So that way I can switch to something like the paint tool and I can move this around and I don't have to worry about that paint baking onto that surface. Now MARI includes a number of different tools for manipulating paint when it lives inside the paint buffer, so prior to baking this paint. The first of these tools is going to be the Transform Paint Buffer tool. You can see it's right here. It looks like a little hand icon. And if we look at our canvas, you'll see that my cursor has changed to this small quad arrow. Now what we can do here is we can actually move the paint buffer around the canvas. You can see here, it has some information at the bottom about it. We can hold the Control key down to actually rotate that while left clicking. Again, we can move it around, translate it where we want it to be, rotate it into position, and if we wanted it to be maybe larger or smaller, again, we could hold down Control and Shift, and we could shrink that down, or we could make it much larger. Now, once we have shrunken that down to where we can sort of see the edges of the paint buffer, notice here that the cursor changes when I get over the edges here. If I go ahead and grab that, you can see here we can begin to pinch or stretch out the paint buffer. So some limited manipulation that we can actually do with the Transform Paint Buffer tool. Now up here in the Tool Properties toolbar, you'll notice that it is configured to reset the buffer on bake. So we can uncheck that if we don't want the buffer to be reset, or we can just go ahead and reset the buffer now, and we'll go back to its original position. So this is one of the tools. The next tool is simply called the Blur tool, and we can grab that right here with this little teardrop icon. Now the Blur tool, if we look up here, has a few more parameters that are available to it. Now really what it has is a painting mode and a blur strength slider. You can see by default we're set at a value of 50. Now everything to the right of that, it relates to the brush engine. So these checkboxes are all for pressure sensitivity of the brush. As a matter of fact, if I came over to my brush editor, you can see alpha and radius checked here, and then alpha and radius are both checked down here as well. Then we have things like the brush radius, the opacity, and the flow. So if I were to just grab my stylus here, we could come over, we could choose our brush tip or our alpha. I'm using the default brush right now, which is absolutely okay. And we'll come over here. And let's go ahead and wait for MARI to come back to me. There we go. And we can begin to blur this out. Now I can use that pressure sensitive nature of the brush that I currently have active to sort of blur slowly in some areas, or if I press harder, maybe we can blur just a bit more. So you can see here that at a strength value of 50, we're not getting a tremendous amount of blurring in this area. But if I was to come over to the face where there's a lot of detail, you can see that we can obliterate that detail pretty quickly here. All right, great. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just clear the paint buffer out with a Control-Shift-C. Let's go ahead and switch to the Paint Through tool with a U and quickly paint a new dragon back into the buffer here. That was the Blur tool. Again, another tool for transforming paint when it is in the paint buffer. The next tool I want to show you here is called the Spline Warper, and this is a really interesting tool because not many applications have an equivalent tool. So it's going to be this one right here. It looks like a small grid, and if we come over and just simply draw a selection around our dragon, sort of like that, what you'll notice here, as soon as I release my cursor, we get this grid that appears on top of the paint that we had selected. So with this grid, we can grab each one of these small points here, and we can begin to manipulate the paint in the buffer. You can see here we can grab the outermost points, we can grab the innermost. Maybe we want the head of the dragon to be a bit smaller, so we'll come in here and begin to drag these around. Kind of rein in that detail. Now there's some options for the warp or the spline warp up here in the Tool Properties toolbar. We can clear out with the transformations we've made here. We can toggle the grid off and on, or we can come in and begin to increase the number of divisions in the grid. So my recommendation for you would be with this tool, don't go too dense with your grid because it becomes increasingly difficult to make changes to paint. You can see here we're limited to only adjusting paint in this quadrant, this series of 4 squares by moving this single point. So let me go ahead and clear that out. That is the spline warper. We'll go ahead and remove that, and we'll just make sure that we are still in the paint buffer, which you can see we are. So the next tool I want to talk to you about is called the Pinup tool, and it looks like a small push pin right over here. This is actually a pretty cool tool because it has a lot of the same type of manipulative properties as the spline warper, but in the case of this one, we get to come in and put in our points. So the way you do that is you simply come in here and hold down the Shift key, and you click wherever you want to add a pin. So maybe we want to preserve kind of the body of the dragon here. So we'll go ahead and pop a few pins down. And I'll go ahead and pop a pin down here on the head as well. There we go. And what we can do here now is we can come in and click on any of these pins and begin to drag. And you can see how basically by doing this, the pin that we're dragging is kind of the center of the transformation or the manipulation, while the other pins are serving the purpose of holding down that detail so that it cannot be moved. So now we can come in here and use these small things here to increase pin strength. As you can see here, if I go ahead and click on that plus sign a few times, we'll go ahead and grab this, and you can see those pins are holding even faster. However, if we were to come in and start to hit that minus sign, you'll see here that the pins are not quite as strong. Now, with this particular transformation, we do need to apply it, so there is an apply button, or we can come in here and just choose to clear off the pins. Now, if I clear off the pins, what you'll notice here is my artwork snaps right back to its original point. So another option is to just reset the pins. That would reset any of the transformations that you've done, but maintaining the pins. All right. This is the Pinup tool, another way we can transform paint inside of our paint buffer. And I'm going to go ahead and show you my favorite tool right here. This is the one I've saved for last. It's called the Slurp tool. Yes, I said Slurp. It's probably the tool with the funnest name inside of MARI, in my opinion. But what the Slurp tool allows us to do is we can come up here and set a mode inside the Tool Properties toolbar. By default, you should be set to Pull. Now we have a radius and an opacity slider here, so we're not really utilizing the full power of the brush engine for this. You can look at this as radius and intensity of the pulling. But basically we can set sort of a modifier here as to how we're going to interact with the paint. With pull, we're going to start to pull the paint in the buffer, so we can, it almost appears like we're smudging when we're pulling this paint. So if I came in and held down the R key and increased the radius of my brush, we wanted to move the head a little closer to the neck, we could come in here and grab that and start to shift that up towards the neck. Now with this, there's going to be a little bit of fall off towards the edges. You'll see here that kind of the most manipulation is going to be centered around the center of the brush. Whereas if we came out here, you'll see here that while I'm moving these little orange and red streaks out to the left quite a bit, we're not moving his face near as much. So again, there are different modes for the Slurp tool. Right now I'm using Pull. We can choose to grow. And again, if I were to just simply click, you'll see here that we start to increase the scale of details inside the brush tip. We can do the opposite of that. We can shrink, and we can come in here and begin to twirl those details, sort of with this rotate option. So the cool thing about the Slurp tool is it does have sort of a undo naturally built into one of the modes. That's what this erase mode is there for. So what that'll allow you to do is paint away any of the manipulation that you've done using the Slurp tool prior to baking. So at this point, this is really all of the tools that MARI includes for actually transforming paint inside the paint buffer. And I think you'll find yourself gravitating to one of these tools, if not multiple tools, depending on the situation that you're faced with.